Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show podcast. Would you like to start by telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do, please?
No problem. Thanks for having me on the show. Really appreciate it. My name is Anton Roberts, and I am a kind of social policy kind of researcher, I would say, in the area of sociology and criminology. So I am a PhD researcher at MMU, and I also work for PERU, the Policy Evaluation and Research Unit as well.
Great, thank you very much. And we're going to talk about your research, which is on homelessness, gender and homelessness. But do you want to say a little bit more all about it for us?
Yeah. So the official title is a mixed method study into the gender nature of homeless communities. So essentially, I'm kind of exploring both the kind of presentations that you tend to see in those kinds of populations from a gender point of view. And I'm also kind of exploring the social capital elements as well. So, the sort of social resources that do or do not exist in arguably quite hostile environments. And that's kind of in a nutshell. Or would you like more?
No, yeah, I was just going to.
I can go all day, Matthew.
Well, I was going to start right from the beginning because I think people are probably aware that homelessness is, majority male. What sort of percentage are we talking about? What is the breakdown of male to female?
Oh, right. Okay. So and again, this is where it gets a little bit tricky because obviously there are different types of homelessness. So if you're talking about visible forms of homelessness, which is what I look at. So I look at kind of street based, rough sleeping kind of forms of homelessness. With that, it's overwhelmingly male. I mean, really, sort of 90%. Wow. That's typical. It's like actually, I mean, it's a little bit more common now, but it's really rare generally to see a woman in a service in that way. And if they are, they're never alone. Usually with a male. If you're talking more hidden homelessness, as we would talk about it in the literature, that is, I think, decidedly more female. But the problem with that is obviously the numbers. Trying to capture that is incredibly difficult because they might be in sort of very difficult home kind of like domestic violence situations, which we just wouldn't know unless they had an involvement in service, or they might be in some type of shelter sort of type of thing, like for maybe for women who are fleeing domestic violence. So that it's actually really difficult for us, for me or any of us really, as a homelessness researcher, just to give you an idea of how large the hidden homelessness population is in the UK. I really couldn't tell you. I wish I could, but
yeah. And your research, does it take place in Manchester? I know that's where you're based.
Yeah. So mine was a primarily ethnographic over sort of a two-year period. So I did it across three sites in Manchester. So I was based in like three homelessness services that cater to sort of street sleeping homeless primarily, I would say.
I probably know the answer to this because it's obviously a major city, but how bad is the issue in Manchester? I mean, I'm based in Brighton. We've got a big homeless problem here. I just wondered how Manchester compares to, say, the capital, for example.
Yeah, nowhere's worse than London, obviously. But I would say Manchester's probably second on that unfortunate list, I would say. And we do have a large problem here. If you're talking about from the point of view of like going to a council and saying, I need assistance, please help, sort of thing, and where you would have like an assessment from a local authority, that kind of shifts between 100, 200,000 kind of thing. But that obviously doesn't mean that they'll get help. That's just where there's an assessment going on, basically. There have been kind of counts, it's usually kind of place at sort of like a couple hundred kind of ballpark figure in terms of like rough sleeping. But again, if you were to speak to the services, they would all say that there's far more than that, because most of these guys will avoid people from the council like the plague. Yeah. So if they're going around going, there's a guy, they won't be there. So when I was all the services I was at, you would see 70, sort of 100 plus in one day. And yeah, some of those were sort of like return service users, but many of them went. So yeah, I suspect it's always a larger problem than we're aware of, usually.
Is there particular hotspots in the city centre as well?
Oh yeah, good question. So yeah, so it's a tough one. So yes, but it's also so much more contested. So obviously there's increased footfall, right? So generally, yes, then there is more people experiencing homelessness there, but there's also much more restrictions in terms of where they can and can't go. So so we have things like PSPOs, like public space protection orders, for example, that kind of criminalize lots of quite ordinary behavior, really, like drinking. Like if you're a student, say, on a Friday night having a drink, that's usually not a problem. But if you're unfortunately someone who's homeless and you're doing the same thing, then it allows councils to criminalize in that way. So we have a lot of those in operation. So yes, there is more of them, but they're also regularly moved on, and it's quite a struggle for them to exist in those spaces often. That makes sense.
Thank you. Yeah, that's useful. So let's get stuck into, before we sort of learn a little bit more about your findings. You mentioned about how you did your research. So a couple of years ethnographic research. Do you want to say a little bit more about sort of your methodology, if you like?
Yeah, absolutely. So mine's a mixed method study. So I kind of drew on a couple of different pieces. My main bulk is ethnographic, just because that's what I've loved the most, even before I was involved in research. I think it's really the only way that you can really understand the social context is by immersing yourself in it. I was very kind of influenced by the kind of early, like Margaret Mead, kind of more anthropological kind of work, and I loved the idea of immersing myself and basing myself there. So that was I suppose the largest element, where I would use a version of ethnography called at-home ethnography. So that's where you actually embed yourself within the organization. So with sort of like traditional hardcore ethno, you would sort of be a fly on the wall, right? You wouldn't be involved in it in any way. But there are those that argue that really, to really know the kind of the language and really what's going on there, you really have to have a more sort of skin in the game, as it were. So I was a volunteer in all these places. So I was not just having informal conversations. I was actually helping the service users in the same way that, or after a while, the staff would. And it also gave me a really interesting insight into the service tensions, as well as the members of staff as well, and their struggles, in a way that I wouldn't have been able to see if I was just on the kind of periphery, as it were. Not that I sort of had a side in any of this, really. I was as open as possible. So that was kind of my main part. And I also did your more conventional in-depth interviews as well, with individuals as I kind of got to know them. And I use something called SNA. Now, SNA is something called social network analysis. So that's where individuals name their connection. So there's a couple of different variations, but I was using it. Well, I was trying to use it, and it's not really been done that way before. I'm trying to use it in quite a qualitative way to really kind of tell a story of social devastation, really, for want of a better word. So it kind of it entails participants essentially giving all their connections in their social networks, and specifically what they're getting from those connections as well, and just like the nature of those, nature and the type of bonds that they kind of have, which I'm trying to, now as I'm currently writing up, tie all this together. So in theory, it will be a consistent narrative, as it were, right? That I'm able to back up with something that's kind of partially quantitative, but mostly qualitative. I think it allows for an unusual perspective, and quite insightful one, I hope.
And you mentioned always being open, volunteering there. So were the people always aware that you were a researcher yourself? You were quite open getting the consent in that respect?
Yeah. So this is always a controversial subject, right? As the blurring of boundaries and how far you go. So I think you can only really figure stuff like that out in the field. If I'm being totally honest, you can always have a rough idea of how forthcoming you're going to be, but you're never really going to know until you're in that situation and what works and what doesn't. So I did have a more general plan of being as kind of I don't know how I'd say it. I'd be a bit more formal and empirical, and I'm this impartial researcher with no feelings. This mindless automaton. But obviously, that's not reality, and that's not who we are. So I kind of had to kind of like develop that, and I suppose it became I think what's talked about in the literature as a strategic undressing. So you
Right.
so yeah, so you share to an extent that improves the rapport, the level of data collection, the kind of the well that engenders trust, things like that, right?
Yeah.
And I would kind of allow the participants to really kind of take the lead in that. So to give you an example, when I was doing one of my interviews, um, one of my participants was obviously talking about how difficult some of the mental health sort of like related strains were of having an experience of homelessness. And there was a bit of a discussion there around therapy, and I could tell that they wanted to say more, but they were self-conscious because obviously it's a male speaking to another male, which is also relevant. So I made the decision then to disclose that I had years ago done therapy myself and found it really useful, and that there was no shame in doing that. And by disclosing that, it then empowers that person to be able to talk about some of their experience of mental health. Now, I could have gone further than that and obviously spoke about my actual experiences in detail, but that obviously I felt that would have been inappropriate, obviously. So there is that line there of like of exactly how much you share as well. So
Mm.
I was very kind of intentional about that. Like, is this going to help them? Obviously, is this going to be inappropriate? Um, it was an ongoing tension and one that we all must navigate as ethnographic research. And I wish I could say there was a cut and fast rule for that, but there really isn't. So in terms of my kind of how I declared myself, that's an interesting one. I think at first I was too honest. I was too kind of
Right.
transparent, and the fact that I was a researcher on homelessness, many of them found a little bit intimidating and off-putting, and it became a little bit of a barrier for me actually like connecting with service users and staff as well, because there was this weird thing where sometimes staff can see you as a little bit like as a bit of an unknown commodity, and they think, well, what's this person doing here, like what's their intention type thing. So I kind of dialed it back a little bit and was honest, but I wouldn't divulge too much. So, I would just say, I'm a researcher, with an
Yeah.
interest in homelessness, which obviously is true. And then if they had more of an interest and they wanted to know, then I would obviously tell them. But I would allow them in a much more organic way to kind of tell me how much they wanted to know. If obviously if I was interviewing them, then obviously there's the full consent and disclosure and all those things. But in a kind of day to day kind of being there, that's kind of how I would tend to approach it
Yeah.
mostly.
And I'm just thinking, skipping ahead slightly for a moment as well. Do you keep anonymity when you come to write up your findings, or is it again that down to them?
Or well, because obviously, well, as you will know, we all have to go through, board committee, ethical board
Yeah.
committees, and that can be quite prohibitive at times, especially when you're working with such a profoundly traumatized, sort of complex group. And I'm on the sort of extreme edges of that as well, because I'm looking at rough sleeping. So they tend to have, all the worst things imaginable that can happen to a person has happened to them. So as much as I would like to, because originally I kind of wanted to have them almost as named authors, almost,
Yeah.
because I'm very much into ideas of sort of like co-ownership, of like co-production and things like that. But for their own safety, yeah, I really have to anonymize. Obviously, like they will be thanked, and there's a discussion there around, maybe I can use first name.
Mm.
I also will be in contact with them in terms of obviously sharing all the insights and results with them. But there's also increased risk with the type of method that I'm using. So because I'm essentially not only interview them about their ideas of gender and things like that, but I'm also capturing their entire social world. So that's actually quite easy to identify if you already know them as well. So I know, so especially since I'm kind of representing that visually, that there is a real risk there that if I'm not careful, I might expose who who they are. And when you think about the kind of prevalence of violence in their world as well, overwhelmingly as a victim, of course, then that's a real difficult one for me. So yeah.
That's really difficult, isn't it, to get that balance right. Okay, should we get stuck into some of the findings then? So is there a common kind of theme that runs through a lot of people's stories in terms of how they've ended up on the streets? I just wonder if there's, this is just my outsider looking in, but I often assume that it's linked to some sort of addiction, a drug addiction, alcohol addiction. It comes first. Is there a common link there?
Yeah, let's just start off with a nice and easy one, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. I'll just throw that straight in there, right?
Okay. Yeah, the causes of homelessness. So, I mean, we can talk a little bit about the lit if that's helpful first, just because we tend to. So I think it was Fitzpatrick that talks about this, but we tend to think about kind of roots in and out of homelessness. So although obviously everyone is an individual and there are individual circumstances, there are certainly kind of common roots that we see coming, through that we will see, time and time again, and sort of certain sets of triggers and risk factors and things like that. So speaking very, very broadly, you will often see, the presence of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. That's really common. There will be a lot of cases. There'll be care leavers as well. See a lot of that. Often, the kind of substance misuse, or at least in my experience as well, is often later, as they've kind of been trying to cope and kind of mediate the things that may have happened to them. I'm obviously acknowledging that I'm slightly biased in terms of my population is male and rough sleeper mostly. So these things can kind of combine early on, and obviously like many of them as well. To be honest, we'll talk about experiences of abuse and trauma at various stages. If they are as well, you think you'll notice as well, like if you're a woman, for example, that there's obviously differences there in your experience. So there might be some violence from a partner as well. Not that that's exclusive to to women. So yeah, those are kind of the kind of earlier ones, and then being a bit more specific in my case, there's a couple of things. So if you're experiencing rough sleeping as well, the longer that you're in that environment for, the more of these kind of experiences, these risk factors you're picking up. Yeah. So your health is deteriorating. You're having mental health crisis. Multiple, as is often the case, and there's a real sense in which these things build on top of each other and just compound. So it's really difficult to pick out any one. In a lot of cases, one is primary. I would say, or one has become more dominant. So with a lot of the men that I speak to, quite a few of them are veterans as well. You often quite see that. So to give you one good example, I spoke to one gentleman who had basically seen his entire regiment be annihilated in a war situation, and clearly had PTSD. And after he came back from that kind of conflict, he wasn't able to reconcile the things that he saw. Immediately couldn't hold down a regular job, and then within sort of 6 months, he was then engaging with services and was rough sleeping. But because the trauma was so intense from that experience, the main problem in his life really was his uncontrollable substance misuse. But that obviously wasn't the only cause. There'd been a real kind of chronology. Sorry again. A chronology to that trauma, but because it kind of he'd been trying to sort of self-medicate, as it were, using various substances, that had become the main kind of problem in his life. Yeah, so it's a mixed bag. It really is. It's so unique, obviously, to like every individual. Sometimes things just combine in a really tremendous or complex way. And it's probably worth mentioning as well that from a societal point of view, we have different ideas of what's considered vulnerable as well.
Yeah.
So so historically, single men aren't considered vulnerable in the same way that a woman or a child is. So that also has an impact on whether they end up on the street as well, which could be a cause in of itself.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, just throw that question straight at you. The reason that I asked that was because I wanted to see if the factors that often lead to homelessness were more specific for men. So, for example, you mentioned risk-taking behaviour. I'm thinking of things like gambling, which we know males are more likely to get into than females. I wondered if, the pressures of being the breadwinner, the provider, that sort of crisis of masculinity. I wondered if there is definite gendered reasons that leads people to homelessness, if that question makes sense.
It makes perfect sense, and I mean I had the same question. I mean, yeah, that's kind of what put me down on this road, like originally, because I wondered I wondered the same thing, because like we do see that in other contexts, especially like in sort of like prison kind of like populations as well. You see the same sorts of presentations, really. So yeah, so in the kind of homelessness context, well, specifically rough sleeping, there is, yeah, the risk taking is huge. It really is. And yeah, you're absolutely right. For many of those men, they're there through kind of an initial, a sort of an initial self-medication. Whether it is alcohol or weed or kind of like whatever else. So in a lot of cases, if things have happened to them, and they've not, and for whatever reason, they've not got the help they needed, and unfortunately, the solutions that many men turn to, which may be okay in the short term, obviously, the longer that they're engaging in those behaviors, the more kind of maladaptive that they tend to become, and just really, again, they just tend to kind of compound further as well. Many of the men that I'd interviewed and spoke to had been experiencing rough sleeping for a very long time. There were guys that I spoke to who'd been rough sleeping for decades, absolute decades, and I'd almost been kind of institutionalized almost to those experiences. And that kind of like inability of men to ask for help doesn't go away, unfortunately. And you would see the same sorts of things. Like, you would assume that if a man is in a situation as horrendous as persistent experiences of homelessness, you would think that they would be more inclined to ask for help, but that is not the case. It's not the case. I would have guys sort of like intentionally masking, downplaying, like concealing how like the bad injuries were. Like, I had one guy who his thumb was almost severed, but was still giving me a hand moving some of the food into the kitchen, and I was just like, what are you doing? What are you doing? He was like, oh, it's fine. It's no big deal. To the point of it being at times utterly absurd. But when you realize that they've lost many of the conventional ways that they might perform their masculinity, they in many ways they kind of exaggerate some of the other areas where they can still perform something. And unfortunately, given the illusion of being resilient and tough and stoic, it's often one of the only ones that, ways that they have left.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it seems to be coming from both sides, because it's coming from the individual themselves as well. But in hand, if society is saying, well, you're a single man, so you're not vulnerable, that's going to sort of play into that as well, isn't it? You mentioned that word like hypermasculinity, so I can see how that happens.
Yeah, it's difficult to kind of it's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario, isn't it? Like to kind of unpick where the hypermasculinity is coming from, right? Whether it's kind of the intensity of the environment, or whether these individuals are already hypermasculine and are kind of going there. But my kind of guess is there's a real strong interaction between the two. So yeah, so the men are being told, in all sorts of subtle kind of ways that to be vulnerable is weakness, and that doesn't just go away even when when you really need the help. It's in you both explicitly and implicitly, and you really have to. It takes time to years. I mean, we're still doing it now, trying to unpick those harmful aspects to our gender identities, and unfortunately, when you're experiencing rough sleeping, you have other things on your mind other than the intricacies of gendered scripts and all sorts of other business. So, yeah.
And how could I ask you how you define hypermasculinity? I know quite a few sociologists use it, but how do you use the term yourself?
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. So for me, hypermasculinity is basically exaggerated tendencies of masculinity. Yeah. So things like like a willingness to use violence, they tend to have quite conservative viewpoints. So it's not always exclusively so, but they can tend to be homophobic or sexist in some ways. They see any sort of expression of emotion as a form of vulnerability and something to really be suspicious of. There's kind of there's just an emphasis on physical strength, virility almost in some cases, and if not violence directly, at least a willingness to use violence to kind of like solve problems. But these things are complex. It's not as if, for example, if you can be hypermasculine without being homophobic, for example. But it's more of like a tendency. You tend to see these sorts of things in these sorts of presentations. Yeah, but these things are obviously nuanced, and you often have men engaging with them in quite like reflective ways. So they'll kind of almost in like a pick a mix kind of thing. They'll pick and choose certain parts to this kind of gender identity that they like, and maybe reject others.
And in your experience, is it kind of used as a defense mechanism? You likened it to prison life, that you can't show weakness, you have to defend yourself. Do you think it's being used in that way?
Yeah. So this is kind of what I wanted to know, because in the prison context, it's really common, and I wondered whether, well, I mean, it was obviously a feature of that environment, right? So so if you're in the sort of prison space, well, more of a sort of high category prison, I think it's a bit different in the therapeutic prisons. But when you're in those kind of carceral environments, and violence is so prevalent, you find that's just it's just really common for men to present in that way. And David Maguire writes loads on this, and he's far better at this than me. But these sorts of presentations, although they were problematic, and I'm not taking away from the negative aspects of those, within that context, they seem to obviously be doing something, and nothing is accidental. All behavior is a form of communication. Like it tends to serve a purpose. So that's kind of why, really, that I sort of drew on the prison literature. So within is a mode of survival, and within the kind of rough sleeping space, which is kind of what my findings are kind of now getting to, really, as I'm kind of going through them. It's quite comparable. It's very similar, really, to kind of like a prison environment, because in many ways as well, like existing on the streets is quite similar to being in an institution as well. Like there's obviously the continual presence of violence. There's limited resources. You constantly be surveilled all the time. I mean, not by prison officers, by members and members of the public, but you are still a site of suspicion at all times. And it's obviously overwhelmingly male. There's a lot of comparisons to be sort of made there. And yes, really, when you're on the streets, and you have so few material resources at your kind of like disposal, one of the few things you have left is your ability to perform violence.
Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately. And also as well that, where you are often vulnerable in all sorts of ways. Like you might be having all manner of mental health crisis going on. You might, well, you will be suffering all sorts of physical problems as well. Showing that is also really problematic as well. Yeah. So men were very, very hesitant to show any kind of problem that they sort of might be having. Yeah. So like if you're in a service, for example, and staff are trying to help, say an individual with a substance misuse problem, they will not discuss that typically, in kind of the common area. Like that staff member would take them away to a private space, and they'd have a very different conversation there, where they wouldn't feel the same need to perform or to front, to pinch a bit of Goffman's work there. So yeah, it's very, very similar. I think I'm probably the first to look at it in that kind of space, but I will be making a lot of direct comparisons, because I would argue they're very similar spaces.
I just wondered, Anton, if you could give us another example. You mentioned the guy with a severed thumb. Was there another example that sort of, in your 2 years of research, really stood out to you as sort of an indictment of this stoicism of masculinity?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is the thing with this type of research. These people stay with you. These stories, these interviews, they stay with you for years. They kind of live rent free in your head a little bit.
Yeah.
Not only because you're going through them all, they're transcripts, but they're really impactful. But no, I had one fellow, and he must have been, I don't know, in his 50s, and he didn't present as what you might expect of someone who was a rough sleeper. He was, I know it's a bit of a stereotype, but I mean, like physically, like in terms of dress, things like that, you probably wouldn't have been able to tell from the outside. So I struck up a conversation to see if I could help, and we kind of got chatting. And he was telling me essentially that he'd been rough sleeping for a couple of years, and he'd been going from essentially town to town. So he'd go from one city or town, go to the service there for a few weeks, and then move on. So I was trying to sort of dig deeper a little bit, and as to why can't you engage your services here and get some help and stuff. And what had happened is he's basically suffered a kind of a relationship breakdown. So his wife had left him, and as a result, his his daughter had kind of blamed him for the kind of family kind of breaking down. And this was just too much for him to bear. This was just too difficult. So the kind of the loss of his relationship with his daughter really just caused a bit of an existential crisis, and that's really what pushed him. I think after that he lost everything. He just couldn't cope. But what really struck me about it, and what really kind of links into the work I'm doing, really, is that he didn't know how to phone her. He had a number. He knew where she was. He didn't know how to emotionally get past that. He didn't know how to he didn't have the language to be able to have that conversation, to be able to tell her what he was experiencing and what he was going through. And he'd been through some awful things, let me tell you. And he just wasn't able to have that. He wasn't emotionally literate enough. And a lot of men aren't to have those conversations. But he had a phone, and he always made sure this phone was charged. And the only reason he had that phone was for the off chance that one day she might phone him. and he's been waiting almost 2 years for that phone call.
It's
Now that
heartbreaking.
it's absolutely heartbreaking, and I can still see him now, and as I say, it stays there with you. It really, really does. Now, if he was just a little bit more, aware of his feelings, and I suppose had that, I don't know, skill set, I guess,
Yeah.
that that men often struggle with, to be able to just say how he felt, and just and just be vulnerable with his daughter. I've no doubt he could have reconnected, but he just couldn't. And he could be doing that for another 10 years.
Yeah. What do you think was the mental obstacle for him there? Is it? I just wonder. I bet so many times he picked up the phone, put the number in, or typed out a message and deleted it. I bet that happened time and time again. I just wonder
Yeah,
what was
yeah.
the final blocker to get him over the top.
I think for him it was the fact that he saw himself as a failure, that he failed to like prevent the breakup of his marriage. He'd failed to like prevent the loss of their family home. And just in because I think he was the breadwinner at that time. He just blamed himself, I think,
Yeah.
really for the loss of everything, and he couldn't. Yeah, he just couldn't cope with that. Even though I don't think that any of that blame was fair, and these things do just happen. Yeah, there was that loss of control and shame, which is that we see
Yeah.
huge amounts of shame with men like this.
Yeah. Yeah. I can imagine that is quite a common theme. Certainly. Thank you
Mm,
for sharing that story. That's
no,
that's
not at
really, really
all.
powerful. Do you mind telling us where you're up to at the moment, and when we can start to read a little bit more about this?
No, that's fine. That's fine. So I'm part time. So I'm on year 5 now. So I've just entered my write up year. So I finished my fieldwork last year, and I'm just at the stage now of kind of starting to write up. Hopefully, my in my findings into something that's quite. I hope that will be quite impactful and will be able to kind of make a real difference, really, to the to the sort of services on the sort of front line. They don't tend to have much of what you might call a gendered approach. So I'm trying to really kind of um, improve that, really, at the kind of like provision level. That's where my findings are aimed at right now. So I work quite closely with the services because I'm trying to really kind of work with services. I mean, not just homeless services, but like potentially others that come into contact with people who are experiencing homelessness, like the police, to really kind of provide that insight into how these presentations, how this behavior presents, and
Yeah.
what this behavior is, and just as importantly, where this behavior is coming from as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mm.
And if people want to find out a little bit more or get in touch with you, do you want to give out some details, Anton?
Yeah, I am on LinkedIn, so it's just Anton Roberts. I'm on there. I'm always open to a chat, so feel free to email me. That's a.roberts@mmu.ac.uk, and I am on Twitter as well, which is social_nomad. Although I can't actually get into it right now because Musk blocked me, but I am working on that.
Great.
Yeah, but any of those are absolutely fine. Always happy to have a chat.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. And maybe we can be back in touch once it goes live, if you like.
Yeah, that's fine. Happily reappear. I'll be honoured.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Anton. Really, really do appreciate it.
No
Fantastic
problem. It's
research.
been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.